Welcome to another exciting interview of Kung Fu Conversations with the legendary, world-class Sifu, Russ Smith. Yeah, I got to blow a little smoke up your skirt, Russ.
I appreciate it.
As my old football coach would say. Thank you so much for joining us today, Russ. I'm super excited to ask you some questions and get into topics and you name it.
The pleasure and honor is all mine, really.
Just in case, I know you graced the airways on Monkey Steel's Speech and had some really great reception there. And as well as your Sifu's podcast, Sifu Mark Wiley. What is the name of his new podcast that he's just starting?
Yeah, it's called Transformations. So he covers a wide variety of topics, really looking to see how people are really growing through their experiences and their art. And, it's not really limited specifically just to martial arts, but it can be all kinds of tangential topics, including spiritualism, Taoism, all sorts of, concepts that, stretch beyond the norm. So yeah, it's not just martial arts, but he's trying to make sure he's got a good representation of kind of flipping back and forth, covering a lot of topics and subject areas. Yeah,
I've listened to a few of his shows and that's pretty great stuff. Pretty great stuff over there. So super impressed.
Yeah. He is one of those people, just super close friend of mine, has been incredibly giving. And I just think is incredibly talented, a real Renaissance man in so many ways. And, I think I am about as, on the top, towards the top of the scale about how nerdy you can be with martial arts, right? Like I'm a collector. I study things about styles that I've never studied and might never have a chance to, but I just always am surprised when I have conversations with him and he's like, back in 78, I was there when this happened and this thing happened. And I was just like, well, I just forget all these places he's been and the things he's seen and the level at which, he's been involved in things that we forget about or have lost track of. So there's a lot of really good things to come from him and his podcast as he starts to release more content. I'm really excited for that.
I am too. Super quick. I don't want to spend the whole show because I've got a ton of only Russ Smith can answer these kind of Sifu Russ Smith answers. Would you, for the audience, give maybe Reader's Digest quick background on what you've studied and what you're currently studying?
Oh, I like what you're currently studying. That's one you don't get a lot. So my background started in Okinawan Goju-ryu, an Okinawan style of karate. So I'm a karate guy from way back. And, I also started Eskrima at that time because I started my training while I was actually in the Philippines. And then when I came back to the States, I continued my studies. So about 36 years ago, I started in Goju-ryu and Eskrima. Probably 25 years ago, I started in Okinawan Kobudo. So Mariyoshi Kobudo. 22 years ago, I started Five Ancestor Boxing. About 12 years ago, I started White Eyebrow, Haka White Eyebrow. I've had a chance to study various things, to lesser degrees, various forms of white crane, Southern white crane, studied some, German sword fighting, which I found fascinating. Love it. Currently studying some Southern Dragon, which is a lot of fun because it's very much the same family as my White Eyebrow and Southern Mantis that a good friend of mine has shared with me. So a good mix of things, but mostly Southern short arm styles relative to my original interests in karate and kind of how karate might have been and was in some ways certainly influenced by Southern Chinese martial arts.
There was something, it's funny because I've just been listening. I probably listened to it 3 or 4 times with you and Will. And it's so fascinating because I feel like you answered some things where my mindset was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I started Wing Chun coming up this October 25 years ago, with Sifu Mayer. We had the club over at Mesa. And that summer, it was kind of serendipitous. I currently live in Longmont like Owen does, which is about 15 miles outside of Boulder. But I was looking around and, the internet was in its infantile stages. So you had these one web pages, right?
Yes.
Just one page.
Yeah.
And they were as much, how do we call it? Chinese Kung Fu sparkles as it was reality.
Sure.
And there was a gentleman in Longmont actually teaching Pak Mei.
Okay.
out of the Waikiu Wong lineage, which is out of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
And he was coming up to Boulder. He was an interesting cat. He was one of the captains of the Boulder SWAT team, but he was going to acupuncture school at the same time in Boulder.
Nice.
And so he was teaching at Third and Main out of a defunct Taekwondo studio, which many years ago, Owen actually did a long time ago, some Taekwondo there. So I think we were serendipitous on meeting as well. But it's interesting because, I reached out to people in my early 20s, like Martin Watts had a one page.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've been reading some of Yang Jung-Ming stuff, and I kind of feel like maybe Wing Chun has this white crane origin. And when I was talking, and I'm going a long way to get to a question that I have for you. When I was talking to Sifu Mayer, he said something, and it reminded me a little bit of what you were talking about, where folks are going back to China to try to explore their karate roots of these white crane, of Lohan, of certain things like that.
Yeah.
And Sifu Mayer said, he's like, maybe Wing Chun did start, maybe, hypothetically, it did start as white crane. But now it is manifested and it's grown into something that's uniquely its own.
Sure.
So are you trying to integrate, you feel like your Wing Chun's missing something? Or are you trying to water them down by cross-training them? And so it does become a personal, journey kind of thing. But I found it fascinating that you were talking about, Weiqi Ryu going back to maybe training with some of the Hutsu-kwan or respected tiger guys. And it's like, is this the ancestor? It's like, no, at this point, they're far distant cousins.
Right.
Because not only do the forms look different, but the tactics are different. The training is different. The power method is different. All these other things. So do you get a lot of folks coming to you from a karate background trying to, how do you say this? Maybe Southern Kung Fu-ize their karate?
Yeah. I think, I think like attracts like, right? And so I think it's really common that people who are interested in what we're doing here at the Burinkan, are probably somewhere along that same journey, right? So before me, Patrick McCarthy really blazed the trail here and exposed the world to a lot of information that we didn't have prior. And then, Martin Watts, of course, has put out great information. I'm trying to do my part to help as well. And for me, in the theme of transformations, right? It has been a transformative journey for me because I, like a lot of people, expected there to be a simple, easy, revelatory answer to the question. And that would be that I would find the secret white crane kata that would answer all of my problems, right? And so I don't think I'm alone in that. I'm quite sure I'm not. And what I found over time is that's the furthest thing from the truth. And I think you really touched a little bit on it, Randel, where the reality is, we're distinct cousins at this point, but the question is, what do you then do with that? Like, do you say, well, I'm me and you're you and we met and we're done and, we cross paths and that's that. And, or do we have a friendship or do we try to learn from one another? Right. And so for me, as much as I, like to put things in boxes and categorize things, keep them separate and treat them all fairly and equitably. I'm just like anybody. As I get older, it's harder to remember the source of every bit of information. It's hard to keep everything in its perfect box. And I don't always tidy up after myself. So sometimes things lay around and get confusing. But the reality is, like, my Goju now is much more Chinese in teaching methodology than it is, Okinawan. Although the physical expression of it is still much more Okinawan than it is Chinese. So when I say that, I mean things including not only like fighting strategies and tactics that are Chinese that I can apply, or I do apply to how I think about usage no matter what it is I'm doing. It's really hard to separate, just pure utility from a stylistic perspective. But I would say the teaching methodologies are very different. So I was thinking about this earlier today, being somebody who trains at Okinawan martial art, Filipino martial art, Chinese martial art, who's an American, I think I'm in a uniquely challenging place to make sense of what those cultural pressures put on us, because, I'm going to paint some real broad strokes. So
please do.
So, we can come back to nuance at some point, but, the broad strokes are something like, Japanese phraseologies include things like, the protruding nail must be pounded down, right? So, conform to the art. Don't ask the art to conform to you, right? So that's one approach to traditions. And it's one way of thinking of things that's culturally impactful. And so what I found when I went to Chinese martial arts was I found a very different style of approach to training, which was more in many ways freeing and liberating, because I basically said, well, if we can agree on the core strategy, the implementation is a matter of detail and example. Therefore, the variation can be widely can cross a wide spectrum, yet still conform to the stylistic expectation, right? And I know that this is also true. You could go somewhere in a Chinese martial art and then somebody could say, yeah, well, their stuff's a little different, but it conforms to the principles, so it's cool. But over at the other table, when he's talking to somebody else, he's saying something totally different, because he's ragging on the guy because, well, my teacher was the fighter and his was the forms guy and whatever, right? So, there's no, like I said, I'm painting broad strokes, but
we have a million of those conversations, by the way, off air, and we're not going to say about, it's
no
still
names,
out there.
No names necessary, right?
That's it.
But to take the good elements of that, right? To aspire to the better portions of what that can bring to us, I think it's important that we do know our art's core principles, whatever they are, because they express some assumptions, biases, and preferences that guide our particular art. And every art has some overlap and some variance in those things. But if you're not clear about what those are, you can end up in places where a lot of karate people there's a real renaissance has gone through the karate world in the last decade or so, where people have been really trying to revive these arts. And well, let me take that little aside, if you don't mind.
Go, please.
I mentioned German sword fighting, and so I'm a real fan of the approach that HEMA players use to be intellectually honest about the activity they're engaging in. So basically, the way I read that, or the way I would say it, is you have people who are reviving a dead art, figuring it out from old texts, trying things, testing it, trying to make sense of the old poems and the old drawings. And I think there's a real level of honesty there. And I don't always see that honesty, let's say, for instance, sometimes in the karate community where people will cross train and then say the information was in the kata all along. But it's like, well, you just did a Brazilian jiu-jitsu movement or a Muay Thai technique, and you're saying it was always in your Naihanchi kata. So, well, let's just be honest about what we're doing, because I think there's a lot of dishonesty in humanity. There's a lot of dishonesty in the history of martial arts and martial traditions, and secrecy and marketing and these other things that lead to dishonesty. So I think for us to do a better job for future generations, we need to document things, be clear about what we're good at, what we're not good at, and just in so many ways try to do a better job. So a lot of directions we could go with that, but I'm not sure where you want to go.
Well, I'll throw you this 2 cents going off of what you just said there. I have a lot of friends that you can see it on the Instagram, on the internet, everywhere. What'll happen is you'll see a movement that kind of looks like Wing Chun. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden they'll be like, look, they're using a Wing Chun hand in MMA. Yeah. And it's funny because the first person to comment on that, and I feel the same way, but I tried to continue this conversation going forward, if you will. By the way, Owen, take a note. We should name the show Kung Fu Conversations. I've been thinking about that for a while now. So, Sifu Alex, I've listened to him talk a lot on his show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Kung Fu Genius, but if you're not, absolutely worth your time. Check out our friend Sifu Alex Richter up in New York. He learned Wing Chun in a castle for 3 years. in Germany. How cool is that? But anyway, so I was like, okay, then I was thinking, okay, if they do use a hand that's, MMA gloved and it maybe looks like the Bong Sao, then why is it not Wing Chun? And so I had to really kind of drive in my head, and I'm like, well, it's the intangibles. It's the tactics that create that movement in space. And there's a reason in Wing Chun that we create this movement. And it's part of the system that makes up the movement. It gives that movement function. And so to me, a lot of the times when I see a snippet of, okay, that looked like a karate reverse punch, is it karate? Is that one movement have to represent the entire system of karate? And what style of karate? And what lineage of Wing Chun? We don't really need any of that garbage in there. But I think that a lot of the things, when I see certain things used in MMA, and that's a good source of reference, is that this? Is it that? It's the intangibles. It's the principles. It's the setup. It's the tactics that make it not Wing Chun. It's not the things, it's not this shape that is Wing Chun and Wing Chun alone. You might see this shape in White Crane. I've seen Southern Mantis use this shape, but for different reasons. And so that's some of the intangibles, that principle-based stuff that maybe you're talking about there. I don't know if any of that.
That really does hit home, Randel, because, I think constantly about this very simple diagram. It's this theory with an arrow, and it points to example, and the example points back up to theory, right? So you have theory driving the examples, which are only well understood through the theory. So I think about it kind of like the, what was this? I'm trying to think back to philosophy, right? The real versus the ideal, right? Mm-hmm. We have the ideal, and that is what the art is trying to tell us, right? These martial arts don't exist anywhere except in theory until you become an avatar of a system, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to think about it's just one interesting way to think about it, right? I mean, you at some point you can become the embodiment of a system if you train it well enough and train it properly, but it's really theory, right? So the theory of Bong Sao should say things like, here are cases and situations where Bong Sao makes sense to use, and a whole series of places where you better not force it, right? So I think this is really the way talk about labeling things. What's an application? What's a technique? It's an interesting thought, right? So my mind has been shifting towards thinking less about techniques and applications and more about what is the skill we're talking about. The skill is closing a gap. The skill is changing a gate. The skill is crossing a bridge. The skill is, moving someone's center. So it's yet another abstraction of kind of how we might think about systems theory. But I do think it's an interesting problem to solve, because to get away from techniques means you have to somehow get away from applications, but applications are the examples we can use to understand the systems. Sorry, that went very high level theoretical real fast.
No, that's okay.
Good stuff. I was just going to mention, that's kind of the way that I do Chinese internal martial arts, and that's a lot of the way that we talk about things. We talk about skills. Instead of talking about individual techniques, we'll talk about skills, or we'll talk about principle, and we'll have inside of those ideas, we'll have lots of different techniques that may
as
represent
examples.
A single skill. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's fantastic. So, could you give an example from one of those arts? I'd love to hear.
Maybe Xingyi, some Sampada.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking of. So we have a series of like bridging techniques, but like in Xingyi we use like Pichuan, which is sort of the mother fist, and really it's represented in the idea of vertical circles. So we would say that's sort of the Jin, which is like the power, and then the actual skill of using it, we'll use it as a bridge, and then we'll use it as a short inside technique. We'll use it to get from inside to outside. Then we'll apply it to we'll apply it to the hands, as well as we'll apply it to kicking. we'll apply it to more of like a wrestling or throwing technique. So, we'll take that single piece and then we'll break it down into a number of different skill sets where it can be applied.
That's fantastic. I love that. And I think that's a great way that a technique was likely created in the past, right? Like to say, what is a technique? Well, it's a movement I found myself using a lot. Therefore, I want to become extremely fast and powerful with it because I actually know of many ways to use it.
Right. Yep. Yep. That's a very good way to say it.
A big transition for me, I want to say I met Owen about 15 years into my Wing Chun journey. And a lot of the first 3 years, Russ, was trying to not do Wing Chun when I was trying to do the Xingyi,
yes.
Right? And you're training the whole nervous system differently. And something and I'm not going to speak for Owen, I'm going to speak as a student of Owen and learning. And a big learning curve for me, and I'll give you an example for it. Owen talks a lot about this, and this I want to say is specific to our Xingyi. We're not talking about every Xingyi lineage out there. Yeah. But if you can't develop the power usage that Xingyi has, then if you see somebody doing what you might call a Xingyi technique, like this is how you enter, or this is, but if they don't display the power, then it's not Xingyi. Xingyi is a power method, and it's multiple power methods. Each of the elements have one, set of power methods or whatever that it really displays well. So you have to develop the skill of the body awareness and the power, and then you can start to apply that power into the practical application of whatever that may be.
That's fantastic.
So that was a big learning curve for me to go through. Yeah. Just conversation there.
That's great. I agree, right? I think that, again, if you think about things idealistically, like from a theories driven perspective, the art is its shapes, its strategies, and its body methods, right? So it has to, I think every art needs to have a cohesive system of those things, and not all of them have a great teaching methodology, but I think that's a thing that I really want to continue to develop in my teaching and for my students. Like, the other half of my brain is on the wall behind me, which is a big whiteboard. And back there, I've outlined kind of the structure of some things that I'm in the process of writing. And part of what's there is a 4 categorization system that I use to think about each of the things that I'm doing. Before I mention that, I'll just say that the earlier method of this was one I learned from Feeding Crane, and they talked about Feeding Crane being made up of, and now this is a Taiwanese lineage of Liu Changyi's family of Feeding Crane. Yep. He would talk about their style being made up of kind of 3 pillars, Xing, Gong, and Fa. Xing being the external shape, Gong being the power, and Fa being some combination of strategies and application concepts. And I was trying to use that methodology to make good sense of other things, and I found it just the tiniest bit constrictive. So here's how I've blown that out just a little bit. I think of just about every style in 4 categories. First one being theory including things like history, morality, teaching theory, training theory, strategy, and tactics. All the cerebral elements of kind of what you're talking about. The next one is body development. And I mean something very specific here. And this is why words matter so much. I spent so much of my career in consulting, and, you want one word for everything and not to reuse the word for different things or different words for one concept. And so I've heard words like conditioning. Well, what's body conditioning mean to you? I guarantee it's different to me. So I'm trying to use really good terms, real precise terms, right? So when I say body development, I mean generalized and sport specific physical development leading to the creation of a body that can fight if necessary, which also has the side effect of developing some positive mental attributes, bravery, calmness, things like that, right? So body development being kind of that second major tier. The third one being body coordination, and that being the stuff that we spend most of our careers on. So body coordination is the posture of the art, the movements of the art, the combinations of the art, and the power and flow development of the art. So basically, a lot of what you can do solo, and a lot of what's in the Taolu and the kata, it would all be that body coordination element. And of course, people who come to train with you who are not natural athletes, sometimes your first 2, 3, 5, 10 years of training, they're not really learning martial arts yet, right? They're learning they're creating the good connection between their mind and the body, which they didn't have because they weren't athletic.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think all of those things lead to the fourth column, which is skill development. And that being the actual application and usage of what you've been presented with so far, right? So put it all together. It's almost like A plus B plus C equals D, the opportunity to actually develop real skills. And so maybe this is where traditional martial arts really deviates from, going straight into a combative sport, right? I mean, that's a long process. Each of those 4 pillars has 20 sub elements, and, it's a very well-rounded, holistic, progressive way to develop a person into a set of fighting skills. But you could also just throw some gloves on and go fight.
Yeah, so, sure.
I mean, that's not to say that our way is the only way, but it is a very good way if you do it well and progressively, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love those categories that you came up with there. It's interesting because, again, you were talking about it right away early, that you're a gentleman from the West that is looking at something from the Philippines, something from Southern China, and something from Okinawa. And so a lot of the lens, I mean, even if we study those cultures inside and out, there'll always be a barrier. And so I think it's okay to try to look through those traditional lenses of those cultures, respect those cultures, but also realize that maybe having a Western set of glasses as well to look at those classical systems, because when it comes down to the end of the day, even though they're classical and maybe ancient systems, if you will, they were developed by human beings with red blood and breathing the same oxygen that we always have been on this planet. I'll throw you 2 cents. I want to just share this with you. If you like it, cool, use it. If not, that's cool too. I tried to develop a lens like this to look at things. And since Sifu Meyer, it's funny because I have an English literature degree, and Sifu Meyer's like the architect, the computer programmer, and the mathematician / psychology major. So every time he throws stuff at me, it's like, I don't know if that side of my brain works really well, but I'm going to give it a shot. But the things that I really looked at, looking at a lot of Southern arts, because I loved the Southern arts and I still do. And then I started working the internal arts with Owen and trying to get an eyeball of what makes all of these thousands of Chinese martial arts similar. Yeah. And what I've come down to is power generation. And I look at it through 2 lenses. Is it a whipping power? Or is it a spherical power? A round power, right? And then the other thing I do is it a whole body unit or is it a partial body unit? And I'll give you an example. Even a great classic, powerful, beautiful reverse punch from karate. The stance is planted. And then the torso and the upper body is moving. Where if you look at something like Baji and Tongbei, the whole body will move for a whipping power. The foot and the hand is moving simultaneously, right? So the lower and upper body are moving in coordination. Western boxing does that quite a bit too. Yeah. And then the spherical power, like if I was, Wing Chun would be a partial body whipping system, right? We can move while we're throwing. We use a lot of whipping power also, but what we like to do is kind of point that stance, if you will, like a little tank, and then go forward there and then hold the ground. And if I get more of that ground, I'm going to feel that I'm going to inch my way forward. But it's still whipping at a partial body power. Right. I would even say, like the Tongbei and the Bagi, those are whole body whips. But you still have to have an essence of the rotational aspect as well. It can't live in one universe and one universe alone because we're more complicated than simple machines, lever, pulley, fulcrum. We are more complicated than that. And then the other thing too is like if I was looking at a partial body spherical system, I would look at something either like wide eyebrow where the stance is planted and then you rotate through the waist and the hips, right? And you're using that rotational power. or even certain Yichuan lineages, they'll move the feet and they'll plant and then they'll rotate through the back. And unlike white eyebrow, where we might be front loaded and front weighted, that Yichuan is using that erect posture and doing that partial body. Where a Bagua, if you're training the spherical walking, the whole body is wrapped. The whole body is spherical, and the foot and the hand timing is simultaneous. And that's a timing aspect to give a body quality. But those are some of the lenses that I've looked at for the power generation and the power function.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, just shows me how much more I have to learn. I'm sorry, Owen, were you going to say something?
No. I had a sort of a follow-up question to something you were saying before. You know, and in the beginning you had talked about, you know, studying multiple styles. And it seems like, you know, I know that your martial journey some of those styles have overlapped with each other. And I know I have studied multiple styles under different teachers at the same time. So, you know, I had a question about, like, so when you're going through that process of studying, you know, different styles, how do you manage that? You know, what's your process of managing that? Because there's a lot of information there.
There is. And you know what, as fortunate as I feel to be able to make some small successes, of course, I wish I had a lifespan that would be 500 years so I could study all the things I want to, one at a time, so I could do them all more justice. I think I've staggered them enough that, I've been able to keep most things, in their proper boxes. I find that one of the things, I think there's a thing that I feel not enough people put enough time into traditional martial arts, and that is real shadow boxing. Like, it took me a long time to realize how badly I was missing that in my own upbringing, was proper shadow boxing in a traditional lens. And so I think when I realized I was lacking that, I started adding that to everything I did. And I find that when my brain switches to white eyebrow, the horse is white eyebrow, the energy is white eyebrow, the flow is white eyebrow. If I'm thinking mantis, boy, I got to really relax, and then I can let the mantis come out, or I can get real springy with a dragon, I think the different styles that I've studied, maybe I've studied them just enough that I feel like I can invoke the right energy when I'm practicing. And I have a lot to learn and a lot more studying to do. And, I certainly would wish I was better at everything that I do. It's hard. Cross training is hard. I think the stance is the hardest thing to get a good stepping patterns that are accurate to every style that you practice. I think that for me is the hardest, maybe not true for everybody else. But yeah, all that said, there's a few things for cross training that are important to me. One is, I hope that through my cross training and my writing and my efforts to try to improve my teaching, that my students will need to cross train less. I would never ask them not to. I would never put any barriers in their way. But I do hope that my journey will make their journey more streamlined and effective. So I hope that out of the cross training. And part of this is just, damn, it's fun. Like, I just love learning. Like, just, there are some things that I do that I hold a real strong responsibility for. Some of my teachers put the responsibility in my hands. It weighs heavy. You carry it. Other things I do because it's pure personal enrichment. It's fun. I learn little things. Sometimes I learn a word. Sometimes I learn a concept. Sometimes I learn a movement, and it fills me up for a month, right? I've been fed. I'm happy. I'm joyous, right? It just keeps me going. So, cross training, I enjoy the hell out of it. I have a few things that are deeply embedded in my body. Some things I don't really teach or would only teach maybe privately, but other things I teach in group format because it's important for me to get them out there. There's a numbers game as a teacher, right? You got to try and get enough people who can carry this stuff on into the future. It's tough.
Yeah. 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 So I was going to ask, in the process of passing a lot of that stuff along, do you find that if you have something that's similar across a style, given maybe it's a technique or maybe it's a skill, do you sometimes, because I've done a number of different martial arts, sometimes I juxtapose something and I'll have to stop, think about okay, which thing goes where.
Yeah. One of the early phases in my training, and I'm sure you guys have probably dealt with this, was how do you deal with difference, right? Like when you encounter the, what's it called? When you encounter an answer opposite to what you understand,
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage that inconsistency, right? And originally, I've been chasing so many dragons over the years, right? Have so many strange paths and things that I look back on and go, well, that was kind of a waste of time, and that was a real red herring. But I lost my train of thought there a little bit.
How about another question?
I'd like to get back to it though. So, in the cross training, forget it. It's lost. Unless you can prompt me back.
Owen, do you want to try to get him going again, or do you want me to throw another question that might lead him back to the cross training?
Just go for it.
Okay, here's one.
Sorry, guys.
No, you're good, Russ. Don't. Hey, it's a conversation. It's okay. I derail things all the time, my friend. Luckily, I don't debust things though, because that's dangerous.
That is good. That's good. Occupational hazard. Yes.
When I was training an old friend of mine in Wing Chun. I was about 4 or 5 years into it. And I really wasn't in a place where I probably should have been training somebody, but I was coming home from college in the summer times and I needed somebody to get that hand play and that biofeedback with. And this gentleman had years and years of like an Ed Parker Kempo and, let's say a Taekwondo. Do you ever find that it's a hard curve to teach people that come from systems that are 100% technique based and then trying to teach them that barrier to entry of what a principle based method was? Because one thing that I had trouble with was explaining to him, okay, you see this hand shape? Well, this one shape might have 6 or 7 different uses.
Yeah.
Instead of, well, when they do this, you do that, which is more, of that cookbook learning style. Have you found maybe a method? Maybe I'm asking for secrets here. Have you found maybe a method, or do you have to kind of let each student kind of overcome that? That's a steep hill to overcome, because if you're so used to learning a certain way, and then maybe you come in with 15 years of, well, when they do this, you do that. And when they do this, you do that. Okay. And then you're like, okay, well, you can do this on this side of your body. And then you can do this on this side of your body. And then maybe it can be this hand defending your side of the body.
Right.
This hand defending this side of the body. How do you start to, tackle that with a new student that's coming into you with the technique based, learning system?
Yeah. So great question. And also I can properly answer the question I mentally derailed on. So, that question, the earlier one was about kind of how to deal with when you're cross training, one technique kind of, conflicts with another. Right. And so, from my perspective, once I got past the point where I got frustrated at differences, I could understand that differences represented more opportunities for understanding, right? So if you said, well, hey, he applies Bong Sao this way, but this other teacher said you apply it this way. Well, rather than taking that as an internal conflict and picking a side, right? Figuring out the right context for each of those answers became much more important, right? So when you can accept the differences that have been passed down to us all as truth, they are true in a particular context, and finding out that context seems to be the important way to make amends with that, in my mind. So that's how I've tried to make sense of that, is to think of it all as more tools in the toolbox as opposed to problems that I've got to rally around from a tribalistic perspective.
That's a great way to put that. Yeah.
Cool. And then, the other question about like how to deal with people that come at this from a very techniques perspective, right? I mean, that is the journey I've gone through in the last like 15 or so years, really trying to work on that. So when I, first realized there was a world outside of being technique centric, I really, my, analytical brain was hotly engaged, and this became my new obsession, right? So understanding what that meant and why that was going to be the answer to all the questions I had about karate. Why, like, I thought I was going to get the secret kung fu manual when I started training, and it was going to give me the answers. And I was going to be like, okay, we do this because of this, and we don't do this because of this. And here's how you use the art. And karate, honestly, most, again, we'll catch some haters here, but I don't want
to
paint too broad a stroke. A lot of karate didn't have the writings that a lot of kung fu systems have. So the theory was more haphazard, more orally passed down, and not nearly as comprehensive as something you might see in, especially something like Wing Chun, which is well documented and the theory's, quite comprehensive. So, I came at it from that perspective. So I really went on a journey to try to figure out, well, what are these strategies and tactics that I should have learned about day one, but I didn't, right? So I started getting pretty down on my experiences and my teachers and frustrated. And, it's only with time can I look back and go, well, some of that was my fault. Like, I'm not the best student. I forgot stuff. I didn't take the best notes. I didn't understand. I didn't take ownership. It took me many years to be able to come to that place and look back and take more ownership of that part of the process. But there was a lot, not presented. So for me, I had to go look at the strategies and tactics that were out there and try to understand how they might fit into my original art, Goju-Ryu. And I had to go look at other arts that I thought were influencers, potentially, geographic cousins, historical cousins, these kinds of things. And so I've come to my set of, my current, I would say I try to be intellectually honest and say the approach that I use is my mental framework. It's not, I'm saying this is the way it happened. These are the truths of the source information. I just find I would say what I have is a very good working model. Whether it's historically accurate or not, it's a good working model which fits with the techniques of the style. And, so for me, it's internally coherent, right? And that's important to me. And so since I try to be honest about that, people can take it or leave it. Other people make truth claims that I cannot stand behind and that frustrate me. So I think if you're going to make a truth claim, you have to be able to back it up. And I think there's scant evidence for a lot of things we want to know. So I wrote, sorry, long-winded way to get to your answer, Randel. Yep. So, I took a very top-down approach, right? I went like strategies, tactics, learning models, teaching theory. Like, how do you go from real high level to then deep dive and make sense of techniques and applications? So my first book, Principle Driven Skill Development, was really well received. Seems to be very popular among certain people, which I'm very happy about. I'm very appreciative of my teacher to help me write the book and edit it and publish it. But what the feedback I did get, that I wouldn't say negative, but the critical feedback was, okay, now what do I do? Like, thanks for the high level map. Yep. Now, how do I get to Albuquerque? Like, I get that I'm on the right planet, but what's next? And so that's the challenge that I've had to undertake the last few years, which is turn the high level stuff into curriculum.
I was just going to ask, are you using, because it sounds like you've got a great working functional model that makes perfect sense for yourself. but are you using your students and their results as the feedback loop to see if that model actually works on somebody besides Sifu Russ Smith?
Yeah,
are you using the student as the feedback model to be like, okay, they're getting this over here, but everybody that I have in this program is stumbling over this and stubbing their toe on it. Yeah. How do I redesign this to make it either more graspable, or do I break it down again into more digestible pieces, et cetera, et cetera? What are you working on there?
Absolutely. And that actually started before the first book was released, because that information was all, the structure of the entire framework was essentially proven in a series of workshops. So essentially I have weekend workshops here multiple times a year. People fly in. And so we do, intensives, weekend intensives, where we go through the material. I make sure that we get people to understand it. We do our best and as quickly as possible to give both the theory and the hands-on examples, and get the feedback. So many cycles of that have occurred. I've probably done 15 of those workshops over the last few years. And then more style specific versions of those as well. So basically from the top down theory concepts, we developed a bridging level 1 and bridging level 2 courses, where we basically have a relatively style agnostic set of training drills. Each bridging 1 and bridging 2, they're each almost like 100 drill variations that teach first the outside gate, which is safer for beginners, and then the inside gate, which is more dangerous but faster to the solution if you can make it work. And then I'm working with one of my teachers now on a series of curriculum for takedowns, unbalancing and takedown material. And then lastly, I'm working on kind of a teacher's manual right now for all that high level stuff that we were talking about before, those 4 pillars and that kind of thing. But so you have to go through that loop multiple times with different people, because we all have different preferences for bottom up or top down thinking, right? So some of us understand better by describing the forest. Some understand better by describing each individual leaf. And so, you just have to meet people where they're at and try to be a good teacher and be a good communicator and listen to what they understand and don't, and really try to craft your message better, because teaching is just a specialized form of communication, right?
Yeah. Well said.
Thanks.
Owen?
No, I had a question about the different styles that you studied, and maybe so I know in some cases people, when they go from style to style, they may be looking for something specific or something related to something that they've experienced before, and they're trying to identify or look for something. Yeah. Or sometimes you run across a good teacher and you're like, okay, wait a minute, this is a good teacher, and I'm not as worried about what they're teaching as opposed to just the fact of being a good teacher. Or I've also had the experience of having kind of both, having some of each. And I was wondering if, in terms of when you're looking at different styles that you've studied, if any of those factors had driven any of your decisions to continue studying with them or to study something new.
Oh yeah. That great question. And great points you make there, because why we start something is not always why we stay with it, right? So,
amen.
Yeah. I'll give you a few examples. I trained Filipino martial arts again it's getting close to 40 years now, but I trained a little bit from many people, and I met Mark Wiley, and he showed me his way of teaching, and I was just like, the one and only time in all my studies that I was like, all right, I'm never doing what I did before again. I'm doing this.
Sure.
Like, I'm just like, none of that stuff is cohesive in the way that this makes sense. This is my path to understanding over here. Right. So that was a real unique experience for me. And it's something I would say hasn't happened elsewhere. I've had a lot of other small, wonderful successes in other ways. So for instance, great friend and my Goju-Ryu teacher right now, just like one of those people who teaches intuitively, like teaches in a hands-on kind of master apprentice way, would never be excited about jumping up and writing a book, or doesn't like getting in front, hates being pushed to the front. But, private, reserved people, I'm sure you all know some of these masters who you just are like, I just want that one, that it's that, like that meme, that like one conversation with the right teacher is worth, is worth 20 years of training. Right. Yeah. So, I'm really lucky to have, him in my life. And, I've cut ties with plenty of teachers in the past who either, through moral or financial or other frustrations I won't go into. I would just say, I'm old enough and, brave enough to just walk away from things that aren't good for me. And I hope that's true for a lot of people. So, I think, if it doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve you. And, life is short. And, if people aren't, doing things for your best interest, or at least, if you can't walk in the same direction, then walk away. And so I've had lots of those, and they've all been learning experiences, and some of them have cut off access to certain things, but in the end, it's for the best, So yeah, I've had a lot of great experiences. I've met some of the most amazing people in my life through martial arts, and I've also met some of the weirdest people that I hope to never meet again.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I'm coming back at you, Sifu.
Sure.
So I tried to think about things that all three of us, even though your systems are completely different than what Owen and I train, and then I'm the only Wing Chun guy over here. I was trying to think of similarities between all those systems, and I would say that you guys have trained the power development methods, or pulling out the power pieces, much, much longer than I have. But something that the Wing Chun lineage, which I feel pretty, grateful to be with Sifu Meyer. And then, you with a lot of your Five Ancestors boxing and, the Filipino, the stick arts and stuff like that. And even some of the Pak Mei, and then Owen, especially with the Xingyi and the Bagua, they have a lot of two-man sets. A lot of two-man sets, and a lot of not just sets, but if you really start to understand what those two-man sets are, that's where a lot of the tactic, the drills, the power, and all those training methods really, really start to develop in isolation. And then hopefully if you're in a deep system, or if you're smart enough to figure it out, you can take that isolated little petri dish, if you will, and start to mix it with other things. And all of a sudden you're adding on footwork with it. And it's becoming an entry method, or it's becoming, an evasional method or tactic, if you will. Do you think that might be one of those, if you will, missing links or missing training modalities in a lot of folks that come to you? And do you think that maybe that is a way that's being overlooked by a lot of the general public? As a matter of fact, like Xingyi, not only do we have like little drill sets like that, but we have long two-man sets, and it's less that there's people that are fighting each other, and it's more like they're equally countering each other. It's like here's an answer to this and here's an answer to that. And it's more like that cooperative, I don't want to say dance, but in an interesting way, it is. There's a cooperation in there. And then when that cooperation breaks down, that's usually when you're finding your holes or doorways to enter for application or technique. What do you think about that, Sifu?
Yeah. Wow. That's a really, really deep topic. And I think you've hit on really the key to everything. Like everything else is preparation for that in my mind, right? I mean, that is the skill development, channel through which we have in our curriculum, right? So the two-man training methods are, where the rubber hits the road. And so, one of the early things that I did was I really took this huge survey of all these 2-person drilling methods, Jeet Kune Do, Wing Chun, Okinawan karate, like everything I could find, and I've been on the internet since it was accessible. So I've been trying to, build a giant library to really do the analysis. And so I've got a few like really strong opinions on pieces of that, and other parts of it. I think it's super important, right? So let me take the part that might sound negative first, and throw that out there. I have a love-hate relationship with long 2-person sets. So the love-hate comes from the fact that the thing you are training the most is to not finish the fight. That's my frustration.
Mm-hmm.
You can gain many wonderful things through 2-person training, even long memorized sets that are not random. You can gain a lot of timing, range, awareness of body posture, reading angles and energy and preparation and intent. So many good things you can gain. But if it's counter for counter, you are training to perform only one of the 2 most important things you can do, which is stop the person from trying again. So the most fundamental, when I went reductio absurdum to the simplest concept I could come up with from a strategy among all arts from a self-defense perspective, basically it was, we define self-defense as one 2-part problem, which is meant to be solved in one timing. The 2 parts are stop him from hurting me and stop him from trying again. If in a long drawn out form, we stop the person from hurting us, but we don't stop him from doing it again, we haven't effectively countered.
Yes.
So essentially the concept of Lin Sil Dai Dar from Wing Chun is not in play if you simply defend and then counter on a second beat. So that's my real challenge with that. Now, I really had this wonderful epiphany about how you could construct the utility of these things. Now, for performance reasons as well, right? They make wonderful demos. There's lots of other good stuff, attributes based, you can use them for. But attributes, that's body development and body coordination, not skill development, right? So that's part of my longer answer is everything's good if you're using it for the right reason and you know why.
Right.
Right.
Context.
Context is everything.
Yeah.
100%. So let's say you took one of these like Kotori Shinto-ryu, right? If you're familiar with this, Don Drager's Budo art, right? The wonderful video of Otake Sensei demonstrating one of their 2-man sets. Vicious, beautiful, scary 2-person set with Boken. These guys are going at it. It's crazy. You watch him. And then you watch him and he describes, he slows it down. He's like, okay, here's what's really happening. And he changes the range and the targeting of every technique is different.
Ooh, that's sweet.
And he goes, oh, okay. Now this thing, which was first a hit to the sword and a parry movement and then a counter here, was really a hit to this target, which would have killed him immediately. So I think it's helpful, and this is the way that I teach the few long 2-man sets that I still maintain. In addition to all the value for body coordination, body development, and attribute development, I also make sure the students are engaged in the mental process of identifying how at every movement they could and should finish the fight with minor change. Often just changing ranges and targets.
That is amazing. I'm going to take that 5-minute beautiful explanation and almost dumb it down to the point where you guys might throw something at me. You ready? Because Owen's close enough that he probably could hit me. That reminds me of somebody watching these long 2-man shingi sets. And then at the end of it, they're like, what did you think? It's like, okay, how do you fight with that?
Well, because it was the blocking set. This was an interesting thing. One of my karate instructors figured out years before I understood what he was teaching me. We had a 2-man set for one of our Goju kata, and he said, okay, well, the base, the thing everybody's doing, we call the base bunkai. Bunkai means to separate and analyze, right? To separate and solve. Bun is like an inch or a minute, and kai is like the process of solving a problem. He said, so what I'd like you to do is at every movement, there are other levels of this. So then we're going to have the punching bunkai. So every time you would normally block, now you insert a hand attack. Next level, every time you do a block, now you insert a kick. Now every time you do a block, you insert a throw. Every time you do a block, you insert a lock. And I didn't realize he knew what T-da shuai na was because he's a karate guy. Pretty cool. Took a long time for me to realize he knew that. And then the fact that he had inserted T-da shuai na in as a solution at every aspect was like, well, he's basically recreating what the Katori guys had done. And
absolutely.
So I just think it's a really nice formula. And speaking of formulas, again, when we're talking about like theory and example, now I kind of stole this wording from the Juklum, the Southern Mantis guys, because they use the word formula a lot. I like it because what I want to teach students is formulas, not answers. And a theory, a principle might be a little too vague. A formula is a little more actionable, and an example might be the results of something that is spit out by the formula, right? So, Randel, I really appreciate you putting me in touch with your teacher. We've been chatting, and I read his book, and I really appreciate you making that introduction. And he and I are definitely more tightly like-minded in terms of our kind of engineering background and that kind of stuff. So a lot of the way he describes things makes a lot of sense to me.
There was a quote that I use from Sifu Meyer all the time. He talks about form, and you're talking about formula. And this kind of goes along with that. And he's like, form without function is meaningless.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you could do a beautiful form, but unless you know what you're doing. And that's a fascinating topic too, is, what is a form? Have you ever taken a look through that lens? Because my goodness, I mean, are you using Jikbu as your first form in the Pakme that you guys use?
Yes.
Which is kind of would you say that that's its own mutated Sanshin, or do you think that it's kind of really
100%? It fits that role. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's in that space because it's a body development form. It's not a fighting form, right? So.
Right. A little bit like, the Wing Chun Sunum Tao, watching me do that, and everyone's like, well, how do you fight with that? I'm like, okay, well, let's look at what's going on, behind the curtain here. What are we actually trying to develop with this form? I've actually mentioned, to people that it reminds me a little bit of, Ichuan. Yeah. And everyone's like, well, how could you make a comparison there? I'm like, well, it's almost like a long Jibin Gong, because what's not moving? Your stance and your posture, and you're moving your hands, and you're also learning zone defense, if you will. You're also learning the angles of the hands and things like that, but you're developing a great structure through the stance and the posture development.
Yeah.
Right.
Structure is a good word for that, right? Structure, form, like the concept of a form that's primarily around structure. And I think that is the Sanshin concept in most Southern Chinese arts. This is your basic power platform, breathing, and posture, typically kind of wrapped up in that. And one thing that discussing, because I'm not very knowledgeable in Northern martial arts, it was helpful for me to have this discussion with Will over on Monkey Stills Peach, because he helped me understand that Northern martial arts often keep the Qigong separate from the rest of the art, whereas a lot of Southern arts have the Qigong built into the Samchen form from the start, right? So it's a little different.
Would you say your Sanshin form has layers of teaching in it and layers of depth? Because, you look at, when Owen showed me Pichuan, that was one of the weirdest damn things. And this is real time. One of the weirdest things as a student I'd ever seen in my life, because I had learned, some of the external forms in Pakme. I had the 3 gates form.
Cool.
And then I had done flower from the Li family, and then I had kind of done their Jikbu a little bit. I wound up learning that later, but I also learned the Southern Dragon form. Like I think he kept 3 external forms from those previous masters. Yep. So I had learned those, and those were cool because those are like 70 or 80 moves.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I feel like I'm doing Kung Fu now.
Yeah. Instead of Southern Shaolin, right?
Yeah. Instead of my stupid Wing Chun form where I'm sitting there in place, I'm like, this isn't Kung Fu. I even think that today, but I still love it. But Owen shows me Pichuan, and it's 3 moves on one side and it's 3 moves on the other. And I'm like,
the same 3 moves on the other side.
Yeah. Right.
The same moves.
Yeah. So it just repeats itself. And he's like, if there was a road to the moon and you could breathe out in outer space, you could do that form to the move, turn around and come right on back. And so the whole concept of what a form is and what a kata is, that kind of went to a different place in my mindset. And then what was fascinating too was those 3 moves, Owen was able to be like, okay, here's the first layer. Okay, now you've been here for a few months. Okay, now here's the second layer of this form. Okay, now you've been here for a year or 2. Now here's the third layer. And so it's the same thing, but your lenses that you're looking at it are different. Maybe it's the Hubble telescope. I can't think of the new one right now, but I'm just going to use the Hubble. Maybe it's that macro lens that you're looking at, or maybe it's the electron microscope. And you're looking at the micro lens on how to look at this form. And so he gave me all these different functions. Okay. Are you developing power? Here's how you develop it in that form. Are you developing coordination? Here's how you develop it in that form. Are you working on, are you thinking about this? Are you thinking about that? And so every stage, it's the same form, but it's not. It really is going into that different river. And so I was wondering, is your Sanshin layered like that? Because you're going to introduce that new student. Here's layer 1. Now here's layer 2.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I teach Sanshin from a Goju perspective, let's say, I'll teach the shape, then I'll teach the breathing, then I'll teach the tension. And those are just the first 3 layers, right? So you just have to start slowly enough to give people things to not, create, paralysis in the student, right? You can't have too much for them to work on at a time. And the way you were describing that, it really brought to mind this process that is like, the distillation process, right? We've talked a lot about cross training, and, you've talked about Ichuan and Xingyi. And I see, through my, lack of knowledge, I'll just make some statements. Xingyi seems to me to be a distilled system, right? It's a distillation. It seems to be a well constructed, tightly, I don't even know the right words. It's not huge and flowery and trying to be a million things, right? It seems to be very focused. From an external perspective, right? And I think that's an interesting part of the journey in a single art or in cross training is we get very hungry when we're in a certain phase in our life, and we want to go learn every form and every way of doing things and every drill, and I want to learn every weapon, and I got to go learn 5 branches of the same art. Well, I learned Wing Chun. It's a small system, but it's only 6 forms, but I learned 5 different branches of it. So now I've got 6 times 5. So now I've got a lot of stuff. But then at some point in your life, you go, you know what? I don't need all that because I can now understand it differently, and I can distill the understanding in my brain and in my body, and I can start to make it my own and really, really digest this meal. And then you take on students, and then you try to feed them the distilled essence, and it's too bitter, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And,
oh man.
And then you go, oh, well, they need training wheels. I got to make training. Oh no, all the training wheels were given to me before. I took them off. Hold on. Let me go grab the training wheels again. So I think it's a fun portion of the process, both internally and, how we approach our students, because we're on different cycles. We're distilling and they're consuming, and then they're distilling and we're consuming if we're continuing to grow as teachers. So I think it's a fun thing to try to figure out and to try to manage. But I think if you're really studying, not just training or practicing, I'm really in the interest of trying to get my students to own their own training. I really want them to discern the difference between practicing or drilling and studying, because practicing or drilling is doing what I told them to do, and studying is you take the radio apart and you try to put it back together and see if there's extra pieces. Like you gotta make it your own. And that's your own shadow boxing. It's your sparring. It's recombining the drills. It's trying to break things, trying to, in Five Ancestors, we have a great saying. It's called turn victory into defeat, or turn defeat into victory, turning defeat into victory. And the idea is put yourself in all the bad places you can imagine. You don't start everything from your baijong. Don't start everything from a ready position. Start from an arm lock. Start from, on one knee. Like, figure out ways to make it work. And that's how you really study what you know.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So does that process for you ever, do you find that there is a place where you naturally go, okay, you know what, I've taken apart and then put back together this piece, this concept a number of times, and you feel satisfied with it? Or is there something else that maybe you feel like you're missing and you need to go back, or is something in between?
Yeah, I think it's got to be somewhere between, Owen. I mean, I feel bits of satisfaction where some work is kind of done. Like when a book is finished, you can put it out and say, please use this. Mm-hmm. And when you understand that, or you feel you understand it, let's have that next conversation, because, in the interest of time and consistency, I think it's important that you figure out a way to leverage yourself as a teacher, because again, part of my goal is to get some of these traditions to survive. Mm-hmm. For my part, the ones that need my help, some don't, and that's great. I think I used to have a real reluctance to accept the idea of indoor students and outdoor students, or withholding things from people, because I actually don't really like the idea of keeping secrets. What I've found through this entire process of going, technique to principle based, is I can give all the best stuff on day one, and it's still going to take people 10 years to understand it fully.
100%.
So what reason would there be for me to put any artificial, to hold back, right? However, now I'll say this, the flip side of this is, if I've given you the work, if you understand it, but you haven't done it, don't bother me about the next thing, because you haven't earned it. You're not ready for it. Like, and I don't say that to be mean. I just, like, I don't have enough time. Like, I don't want to do this. Like every teacher, I don't want to teach the same white belt shit my whole life. And so I get that whole indoor outdoor thing from that perspective. If I took the time, the weeks and months and years to write this stuff in a book, read the book, do the work, do your part, own your training, and take on your part of the responsibility. Because I'm not going to ask you to pick up 3 corners of the thing, mm-hmm. but you got to pick up your part. Like that whole Confucian concept of like the teacher picks up one corner and the student picks up the other 3. Sorry. Yeah. I cannot fall in line with that. The teacher has the bigger responsibility, because the sender of a message in any communication scenario has the responsibility for determining if the message was received. The receiver cannot be the one that says it's accurate. They don't have the ability to. So why put that on the student? Right?
Yeah.
But the student has to do a part of it. So I would say that's my current kind of feelings on the whole indoor outdoor thing. I think there, at some point you have to say, look, I've given you your part. You either do it or don't. Like, some of my teachers know I haven't gone to the next level in the thing, and it's my fault because I haven't had the time or the focus, and that's on me, and I own that.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Russ, what are you currently working on besides all this teaching in your own training? What are you trying to focus on in your own training right now?
Yeah.
Because I know at some point, you've got a developed curriculum, and question for you: how far do you think you're able to take people? Are you pretty sure you've got the standard introductions, and then you can get them to an intermediate phase? Do you feel like you've got those couple levels, and then, or are you still making the framework for the higher level and the higher functioning of those systems that you're teaching online? But I'm sure you've got to have your own work that you're trying to keep fresh and keep functioning for yourself. Yeah,
I'm not getting any younger, and I've got my own health challenges like a lot of us do, right? So, number one is trying to do my best to be healthy, stay fit, lose weight, get stronger, be more supple, all those things that I need to do to stay active well into my late years, and be a good example for my students. Those things are important to me. Continue to refine. I'm more focused on my students from a training perspective in a lot of ways than I am on myself, but I'm still learning new things and enjoying that, and really trying to make sure I understand things well enough that I can bring people to the highest levels that I can. My goal for a long time has been to make sure my students can all surpass me, in a fraction of the time. And that will be my goal. Part of it is just continuing to write. Part of it's continuing to teach workshops and teach. I'm teaching online as well, so that it's as an adjunct, for when people can, periodically make it here physically. So, it's just a combination of taking care of myself, continuing to learn and study, under my teachers, and be heavily focused on my students. And there's a lot of writing involved as well. So, yeah.
Right. Owen?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I'll keep this rabbit hole going.
All right.
Is there someone out there that you think that we should be looking at, that you, besides your Sifu Mark Wiley, he's got some great stuff going on with his new podcast, Transformations, but is there some other folks that you think that are either under the radar, or maybe they're in a whole different genre? I'll give you some examples. Somebody that I think is absolutely fantastic, if you're not familiar with this gentleman out of Canada, Coach Kevin Secours. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that cat. I'll send you some of his stuff, but I really like how he teaches. He's kind of come up, I don't want to say really come up with, he's had lots of years of training with it, but he is a lot like yourself. He's got years and years of great traditional martial arts. And I want to say in the late 90s, he found Systema, and he fell in love with it. And he got out about the time that they were getting to the spiritual side of things. He's like, nope, no thanks. And so he's like, okay, I've got Okinawan, he does Okinawan jiu-jitsu.
Oh, cool.
And he does some Kobudo. He's done some karate. He's done some kung fu. He's done some arnis. He's done some eskrima. He's worked with tons of these masters, from Dan Inosanto to Tony Blauer, before Tony Blauer invented the spear system. We're talking 25 to 30 years ago. Cool. And so he's worked with all these people, and he's got a really functioning teaching platform. And then you've got people like, I'm a huge fan of Josh McKinney. He's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. He's 38. And I think you can listen to the I Suck at Jiu-Jitsu show. That's his podcast. Great name for a show. Yeah. And it's funny because he talks like a coach. And so I don't do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he'll talk about pace, timing, rhythm, position, and tactics and mindset. I'm like, I'm learning something. I don't know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu,
right?
But I'm learning how he takes his information and use Western terms that we're all used to, right? Because we have our specialized Chinese terms, our specialized Japanese terms, Filipino terms for yourself, but we also have rhythm, timing, pace, function, grip, all these things. Another guy, last one, is Fran Sands, my boxing coach. I love that gentleman. A true teacher and a true gentleman. He teaches over in UK in the rough neighborhoods, and him and 4 other coaches basically teach for free. Make sure those kids do their homework, get a good meal to eat, things like that, those kind of things. And he's a great, great boxing coach. He's got thousands of hours of free, maybe it's hundreds of hours, more like 300 or 400 hours, but he's got hundreds of free, great boxing tutorials that are just some of the best I've ever seen in my life. Is there some folks out there, long-winded way to say it, as I share those people with you?
Sure.
Is there folks out there that you're like, oh man, nobody's paying attention to her over here, or nobody's paying attention to him over here?
Yeah. But yeah, there's a couple, that I can think of right at the moment. And I may need to follow up with you afterwards, for some others, but he's not a kung fu guy, but my karate instructor is quite a huge influence on my life. His name is Marcus Davila. Highly influential person in my life. I think he's a real hidden gem in the martial arts world. Another would be a friend of mine. His name is Alex Do. He was a student of Kim Fu Mark. I think he's a great guy, and he's shared some of his Juklum with me, and I think of him very, very highly. He's a high hand. One of my students, but also a teacher in his own right, is Sifu Joshua Durham. He's an instructor in 5 ancestor boxing under the Kantekwan lineage. And he's a student of mine in White Eyebrow and a great close friend of mine. A few guys that are really important to me. And whether or not they'd be interested in coming out more publicly, I think time would have to tell. But
very good.
Definitely would recommend. I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat with you. I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
So usually, I at the end of these things, I like to ask, do you have anything that you want to promote, or do you want, we'll put your website and we'll put some of those things, those resources in the show notes, but if there's anything in particular.
No, really kind of you. Thanks. I have several books that I am continuing to try to make sure people know about. The first book was called Principle Driven Skill Development. It's now available in multiple languages, including English, German, Italian, Dutch, and Spanish. Cool. So if anybody is interested in kind of a very high level generic concept around principle driven ways of thinking and training in martial arts, highly recommend that. If you're interested in 5 ancestor boxing at all, I wrote a student manual. There's a volume 1 out. There will be a volume 2 out soon. It is a student manual, so it may not be for everybody, but it has some really interesting theory in here for people who are Southern martial arts stylists that might be of interest. And this other book that I have, it's called Overview of Fujian Taizu Boxing. This, for me, is such a special book because it's a small book, but it really is like secret kung fu manual shit. And so, for me, this is like movie stuff. When you think about all the tropes and all the movies, as somebody stole somebody's boxing manual and learned the secrets and then wanted to fight the teacher or whatever, I came across enough resources to be able to do this translation justice. I'm really proud of it. It's a small book, but I think it's really powerful in the way that it talks about Southern boxing. So anyhow, it's called Overview of Fujian Taizu Boxing. All those books are available on Amazon.com. And then, if anybody's interested in Mariyoshi Kobudo or 5 Ancestor Boxing, you can potentially engage with me online at Burinkan. And typically I'm on Facebook a fair amount.
Awesome. I'm not done with you. I've got two last questions, right, and then I'll let you get back to real life. I apologize.
No, please. Fire away.
Something that was unique about your Kobudo, and you mentioned this to Will, and I think it's something, the only other system that I know that does this, and Owen really helped me understand this, is the richness and the depth of Xingyi. Because when I started to do the animals, I'm like, I'm going to master all these animals, and I'm going to be great at all of them. He's like, well, you'll probably have 2 or 3 that you really can focus on, and you'll really want to tailor into. He's like, and then the other ones, if you feel like passing on the system, you'll need to learn those too, because each of your students, what might work for you won't work for your student, but they might find an affinity. Maybe say you're not a monkey guy, but somebody else might be. And so there's the tailoring process, if you will. Could you tell it? Because that tailoring process to the student. Yeah. I think it's something that a lot of people don't hear enough about. And I was blown away that you had an Okinawan or Japanese system that did that. It was weapons based, but that teaching formula seemed almost devoid, or I had never heard of it in any Okinawan or Japanese systems. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And maybe the stories are a little mixed up, just to clarify. So the Kobudo that we do is an amalgamation of Chinese and Okinawan arts. And it covers a whole broad spectrum of weapons. Like a lot of Chinese systems have the titular 18 weapons, right? So Mariyoshi Kobudo is a lot like that. Well, I think maybe the story you're thinking about is Gojuru. So originally in our style of karate, the story was that, Miyagi Chojun of Mr. Miyagi fame, had his teaching method originally was supposed to be that he taught each student sanshin as body development, and then one or two other kata or taolu that they would specialize in. And then upon his death, all of his primary students got together and shared the 12 total kata that he had taught. And now everybody in the system all tries to do all 12 kata. So interestingly, that story is very similar to what we have in our 5 ancestor boxing, which is 5 ancestors is Taizu, as I'd mentioned in that booklet, Lohan, Dazun Chuan, Damo respecting boxing, monkey boxing, and crane boxing. So it's an amalgam of kind of the 5 most popular styles in the Fujian province over time. And because the style is so huge, it's on the order of the size of like a lot of Choile foot systems, like 50 forms and weapons and all this stuff, and dozens of 2-man sets and all this. So, what we didn't hear in karate was, how did Miyagi decide which form suited which individual? That knowledge, as far as we know, wasn't passed down. So we don't have the rubric that says tall guy learns this one, fast guy learns that one, short guy learns that one. Yeah, we don't have that, right? And so the nice thing about 5 ancestor boxing is we have more of that information. It's maybe not exactly cut and dry, but each of the ancestors is probably more like you just described, Xingyi's animals. Monkey is about adaptability and hitting the three levels. Crane is about whipping energy and evasion. Lohan is about evasion, but with boxing, whereas Taizu cuts right through the center, right? Dazun Chuan is about developing the body, right? So with those aspects of the art being focused on those ancestors, you can work with the student to understand their interests and aptitudes and give them the ability to specialize past the core. So I've worked with my teacher to make sure that the teaching methodology for 5 ancestor boxing goes back to the old way, which is there's a core model where everyone learns the main 5 roads. And then from then you can pick and choose the ancestors that you want to specialize in and move from there. And everybody doesn't have to learn everything unless you really want to be kind of a lineage holder level instructor. And then you've got your work cut out for you, but that's up to you, right?
Very much so. And this is my last one. That's amazing. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for answering that. This is my last one. I think it's specific for you because when I wanted you on the show, I had read your book, and I've got to say, I'm going to say that's one of the top 5 martial arts books that I've ever read. And back at you. Thank you for the time, and thank you for the effort and the work in it. I think something that's unique about listening to you, I've listened to a lot of your, from Facebook, your YouTube talks and things like that. And your teaching perspective really reminds me, it's different than Sifu Myers, but it really gets the student to engage and think to for themselves.
Yes.
And through the system, through the lens of the system. As you hang up the show here and leave us, if you could have a message, not for the students, but for the teachers and these classical trained arts, maybe a teacher is burnt out. Maybe they're looking for something new. Maybe they're just, it's my way or the highway. Maybe they're just so, embedded in their own way of teaching, or, maybe they're about to close their dojo down, whatever it may be. If there's one message that you could pass on to some of us, because a lot of us are similar here in the West, we're teaching classical martial arts, whether it be from Japan, China, Indonesia, whatever it may be. Yeah. If there is a teaching message that you could give to everybody, what would it be?
Yeah. I think the message is to figure out how you can come to terms with tradition. Figure out what your relationship is with the tradition that you're a part of. What's your role and responsibility, and how can you adapt so that you can take what is by its nature a conservation exercise and adapt yourself and your teaching methods so that you can help progress that so that it can survive into the future. Because if you hole up, if you turtle up and insist on doing things only the old way, then things will die in your hands. So that's my advice. Figure out your relationship with tradition and make the best of that.
Sifu Russ, thank you for your time. That was awesome.
Fantastic.
I had a blast. Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys.
We hope to have you on down the road, but thank you for your time today, and we look forward to conversing in the future. Have a blessed day, my friend.
You as well.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.